Another reason to use El Nino and La Nina as methodological tools is that the information that we need to use them is readily available. Geographers and scientists for the past 30 years since they began studying the El Nino and La Nina have been cataloging their incident, and they have built these chronologies about when an El Nino occurred, when a La Nina occurred. And this is the most recent, the most comprehensive article published in 2009 by two geographers from New Zealand, Joe Gerges and Anthony Fowler. And what they've done is they set up chronologies for 475 years in which anybody who wants to work on this can go, pull up this article, and see in what particular year what conditions existed. The nice thing about this is that they did their articles into a bar graph, so that for a period of 10 years, they have plotted the incidences of the El Nino and La Nina on one side. This is the El Nino and this is the La Nina. And here are the extreme events. The extreme events are listed in red, all the way down to weak to almost non-existence. And you can see that there were several decades when there were extreme events. Now, what to do with this type of information? This is where it becomes relevant to historians. What I've done with this is I've taken two periods in which El Nino and La Nina were prevalent and then dormant, and I've superimposed them with climate cycles. The first climate cycle you hear is something called the Maunder minimum. The Maunder minimum was a roughly 60 to 80 year period within the Low Ice Age in which temperatures were much cooler than normal. So you had a cool worldwide temperature, and then you have an even cooler still worldwide temperature. Right now, the science believes that it was due to a lack of sunspots. At the end of the 18th century, you have something called the thermal rebound, what I call in my book the warm anomaly. By the mid-18th century, temperatures had been rebounding away from this Maunder minimum. And so here is my hypothesis. In between these two periods of very much colder weather and very much meaning half a degree, warmer weather, you will have time periods in which climate is unsettled. You have one here, this is the cycle that I will talk about later on the Florida frontier, and then you have another period here that should be of interest to Florida historians because this was an incredibly unsettled period in Florida, the early 17th century. So, moving on to the second half of my presentation, I'd like to talk about these two specific extreme events in Florida in the 18th century. One is in the latter half of the century, roughly 1750 to 1800. The second is coming out of the Maunder minimum, and right now my research stands in the 1730s and 1740s. So if we go back to what should now be a familiar image, there is the image of the late 18th century warm anomaly. As you can see, from roughly 1750 to 1800, this 50-year cycle of temperatures were much different from this and much different from this. I've plotted a line here that the temperatures in the 1770s and 80s were the same as they were in the 1450s. I've also highlighted the very low parts of the Maunder minimum, the cooler part here, and then this cooler part, which we showed you on the introductory during the Napoleonic invasion in 1812. If the number of hurricanes is tied to heating, and if the Earth's temperature is warmer at certain periods of time, one would expect that we would have more hurricanes during a certain time period. And apparently the National Hurricane Center agrees with us, because this comes from their website. This is a recent graph, about 2013, I think, and it shows that during this the thermal rebound, the warm period, the number of hurricanes increased. As we go up into the 1920s and 30s, from the temperature graph that we saw, surprisingly, the number of hurricanes increased. Now, the argument has been made forcefully that you can't tell back in the 1770s because you don't know the actual data. And so what the Hurricane Center did, is years ago they only had this graph with this number of hurricanes. What they've done, these shaded numbers are hypothesized storms to take into consideration things that may have occurred that they have no hard data. The majority of this data comes from insurance losses from Lloyd's of London, in which ships left a particular port and they didn't come back. And so even if you're looking at the hypothesized data, you can see that the number of hurricanes in this time period in the late 18th century, 1770s and 80s are much greater, even hypothesized, than even the present day. Now, all this scientific data, for some of us it's fun. Oops, wrong click. And I apologize, this is really difficult because I can't see what I'm doing. These are the consequences for the region. This graph comes from an article I did several years ago, and I took one specific year, the year 1772, and using historical data, I plotted the number of hurricanes that made landfall in the Caribbean. This represents hurricane season, roughly 12 weeks from June to late August. In the Caribbean, 18 landfalls occurred. Now, to be honest, these were not 18 different storms, these were 18 different landfalls. But wait, what makes this important were the consequences. The consequences were that when these hurricanes made landfall, they destroyed the crops in the ground. They also destroyed the crops that were in storage. And so after a period of 3 months of solid hurricanes and storms over and over again, the Caribbean populations were starving. There was no place to get food. They had to get food from someplace. The place they got the food from was this little town called Philadelphia. Inside Philadelphia were a batch of men called delegates to Congress. And the delegates to Congress at that time were trying to figure out a way that they could pay for something called the American Revolution. And when this catastrophic weather occurred in 1772, by 1774, when the delegates began debating about new places, new markets they could sell their flour, they found a ready market in the Caribbean. Now, they always had access to the British markets. The important part is that after 1774, and especially after 1775 and 1776, the Spanish colonial markets opened to the Philadelphia merchants. And they were no longer dependent upon Great Britain to sell their flour. They were then allowed to sell it into the markets in Havana and in the other Spanish islands. So I think this is a really significant development, that one of the contributory, not the only, not the main, maybe not the main, maybe not even the 10th most important reason for the declaration and the separation from the British colonies was the ability to sell flour outside their traditional mercantilistic markets. And this is the argument that I developed in my book that was published in 2011. I take this argument and extrapolate it out to the entire Caribbean, to all the Spanish islands and all of the other islands. Major change in trading patterns. What does this mean for Florida? It means for Florida, for the people who lived in St. Augustine in the 1770s and 1780s, it meant that they were offered a bonanza in economic activity. Men and families who were marginalized during the British period. The British period was 1763 to 1784. Men who were marginalized during that period were offered an opportunity. When the Spanish regime came back in 1784, that opportunities increased, because now they not only knew the markets in Baltimore and Philadelphia, they also knew the markets in the Caribbean. These families for those of you who know the Spanish and British period, these were the Menorcan community. Varied people, some Menorcans, many Italians, many Corsicans, primarily mariners. These men experienced unprecedented opportunity in social mobility. And in 2, maybe 3 decades, they became the leading families in St. Augustine. They were important in the constitutional period in 1812. They were signers of the Constitution in St. Augustine when it was put in 1812. And it's an example of capitalizing upon opportunity that was there for them. And this article was published in the Quarterly back in 2002. So now I'd like to turn to the pivot period in the end of in the 1730s and 1740s, coming out of this cold period, the Maunder minimum. And as you can see, I've highlighted again here the difference in temperature right in this period. And it doesn't matter which of these studies you look at, it all shows an increase in temperature. Briefly, Spanish Florida was being assaulted by the British colonies pushing down from the north, from Carolinas. The foundation of Georgia was particularly critical in 1732 because now the enemy was on the doorstep, if you will. In 1739, 1740, Spain and Great Britain nearly went to war. In 1739 and 1740, Great Britain and Spain went to war, and the person who was selected to carry the war to Spanish Florida was James Oglethorpe. And in 1740, he laid siege to St. Augustine. Anybody who does Florida history will recognize this very, very well-known and famous picture of the British siege of Havana. One of the contributory factors was the Spanish sanctuary policy. Briefly, Spain encouraged enslaved peoples who chose to leave their non-Catholic masters, encouraged them to come to Spanish colonies and to become Catholics. It did not automatically come with freedom, but frequently it did. And if they served in the military, or the militia, they would be gradually granted their freedom. If you attended Dr. Landers' lecture last year, Jane Landers is perhaps the world's expert on this process, and she's certainly the world's expert on the community that I'm going to talk about just here. The escaping slaves came to St. Augustine. They were placed in their own community, Gracia de Santa Teresa de Mosé. Mosé was located north of St. Augustine. It was their own autonomous community. This is not a picture of the 1740 community. That community was destroyed in the British invasion. This, however, is an artist's rendering of what the new community began after in 1752. I argue that the Mosé fugitives who left Carolina in 1738 were successful because of environmental conditions. I contrast their experience to another group of attempted fugitives, the 1739 Stono rebels, and the Stono rebels were not successful. They attempted their escape just a year later, but I'm going to give you evidence and show you why I believe the Mosé people and other people were successful and the Stono rebels were not. The comparison between the Mosé slaves' failure can be attributed to environmental stress on the frontier in the regions between and among the three colonies. The early groups turned this environmental stress to their advantage. Okay, the argument that I'm making in this portion of the talk. Number one, weather hazards impacted the region during the period of disequilibrium from 1736 to 42 and provided triggers that had short and long-term consequences. In the short term, prolonged drought and stultified heat in 38 finally gave way to excessive rainfall and flooding by August of that year. The immediate result was environmental crisis in crop failure, disease, and social dislocation. Important, government authority was strained. It could not cope with the environmental crisis, it could not cope with the social dislocation, and order broke down. And finally, we can see social dislocation not only in the Mosé fugitives, but also in other groups, in indigenous groups, in convicts, in servants. And I think this is key to the argument that this environmental crisis affected everybody. And again, the pivot phase, returning to this drought. The drought in 1738 was equivalent, if not worse, than the drought in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. It's the second most severe drought in North American history. And we can drill this down even further by going to these paleoclimatology websites. These are specific dendrochronology examples of samples taken throughout the U.S., again, similar to the map I showed you earlier. And if you look at our region in Florida and Georgia, on the Palmer Drought Severity Index in the 1736, things are not too bad. They're wet. They're either normal or wetter than normal. But just 1 year later, things go from wet to dry. And then we go to, this is 1737, we go to 1738, and it's even drier still. I'm sorry, 1730. There's 1738. And then on to 1739, things are going back to normal and wetter, and then again to drought. If we plot this on the El Nino, bolstering the evidence, we see a similar situation. We see 1710, 1720, 1730, you see extreme El Ninos and predominance of El Nino by the time of 1740, the 1740s, it has switched over to a prevalence of the La Nina. And again, I can't stress enough that when you're used to one condition, that when the conditions in which you're living change and change suddenly, that's what causes social dislocation and social disorder. On the La Nina, the bar chart, the prevalence of the El Nino on this side, and extreme El Nino in 37 and a weak in 38, and if we go over 39, we have a series of La Ninas, very severe to extreme by 1742. So, I have evidence for all of these three colonies. I have evidence for Carolina, I have evidence for Georgia, and I have evidence for Florida. In Georgia, there was severe drought, there were smallpox epidemics, an epidemic followed by a yellow fever epidemic. There are different diseases and different transmission, but nonetheless contributes to social disorder. And it also contributes to political disorder, in which the governor is asking the people to please everybody, go and pray. Same thing in Georgia. In Georgia, the drought began in early summer. In the source that I read, the excessive heat kept people inside. People were literally dropping dead from heat stroke by going outside. By June, things were, the government facilities shut down. The provincial court adjourned in July. Police functions stopped, and there was chaos on the frontier. And in Florida, we have the fewest records, excuse me, for Florida than we do for the other. For the other areas. Anyway, we have the fewest data for Florida than we do for the other areas, but we have, thank you, we have examples in especially in the indigenous population. The indigenous population was affected the most. So much so that they made war on each other, and a couple communities were completely wiped out. This is the exceptional work of historian John Hand. We also know that the military garrison was affected. There were examples of settlements being attempted and abandoned, and finally the social convicts escaped to the Carolinas, and again, social order was compromised because of the weather. Within this context, the 23 Carolina slaves left Carolina and arrived in St. Augustine in November of 1738. And here what I have done is I have put these together in a chart that shows exactly what happened in each of these: the food shortages, epidemics, crop failures, famine, internecine warfare, and migration, all a consequence of this series of extreme events. And so the people that left the North Florida and the indentured servants, this is all the successes in 1738, people who were able to take advantage of environmental leave. And these, the Stoner rebels, are the failures. I argue that by 1739, not only had the conditions improved, but the authorities had gotten a handle on the extreme weather and were able to launch a campaign to restore order to the border. Okay, and so in conclusion, I have a few things that I want to close with, and that, in my opinion, it's futile to argue the question of climate change. I think climate change is real, climate change happens. What's really important is how we deal with it and what we do with it, how we deal with it on a daily basis, but more important, how we deal with it as a scholar. And I think there's opportunity for people who want to do history and want to link these two together. There are plenty of opportunities where you can take evidence of climate change and put it into your own research. There are, however, some methodological issues that I want to bring up. And first of all, we never use the word prove, but can we demonstrate that climate and weather are at fault? And we always have to ask ourselves, what is the threshold of convincingness? A phrase I borrowed from a friend of mine who works on climate, and was saying, how do we convince you that this is happening? How do we convince the readers that this is happening? Secondly, what do we look for? Should we look for disaster, or are the responses of the people cultural responses? Are they mental attitudes? The two most important, avoid hyperbole. How many times have we heard about the 1,000-year flood in Carolina last week? Or how many times, if you read journals, this is the worst winter we've ever experienced? Of course. Yes, because you haven't experienced the one that's coming next year. But the point is that we can't take some of these diaries and personal accounts and letters at face value. In my opinion, they have to be backed up by recoverable scientific data, which is hard to do before 1870 because there were no instrumental records before the Weather Bureau was established. And finally, my favorite is, can the paper archives corroborate the scientific data? That is a really tough question. It's also a tough question because if you start out with the evidence of drought and hurricanes, instinctively you go into the archives looking for the data to corroborate that. You already have your question asked and answered, and therefore you have to avoid the tendency to only rely upon data that support your hypothesis. Because sometimes the data do not corroborate your hypothesis. And finally, what do we do with this? Where do we fit this into Atlantic or Pacific world history? Where do we make it relevant to people beyond our narrow audience? And these are places where I think these are turning points, these are pivot points in Florida history. The 1560s to 1590s is a pivot point. It's already been established. Severe drought in Mexico. What did that mean for Florida? What did it mean for Menendez de Aviles and the Jesuits who gave up on Florida, the Franciscans who came in? We know the 1640s to the 1660s are a period that we're going into the Maunder Minimum. We also know it's a period of severe indigenous rebellions. Did the change in temperature, did the change in climate have anything to do with that? The 1760s to 1780s, I've done work on the Spanish colonies. Nobody's ever touched the British period. Nobody's ever asked the question, what does this mean for the planters who came with James Grant or with Patrick Tonin and wanted to make a go of it and couldn't? The 1840s to 60s, the little ice age, the cold period is waning. We're going into a warm period. Into the 1870s to 1890s are notable for El Nino and La Nina activity. And finally, anybody who lives in Florida who hasn't heard of the 1926, 28, and 35 hurricanes, you don't watch much television. So these are places where, if you're interested in Florida history and want to put these things together, they're the places to start. And finally, just to make you happy at the end, the temperatures are no warmer today when the Vikings were conquering the world. And so if we take that as ending on a happy note, if you have questions, there's my email. Dr. Lester has my email. Dr. Murphy has my email address. I'd be glad to talk with you over the phone or in person or on email. And I just want to thank you all. I want to thank Dr. Fernandez, Dean Fernandez, Dr. Lester, Dr. Murphy, the Quarterly, and the UCF History Department. And most of all, thank you all very, very much. I'll be glad to try to attempt. Let me also mention, oh dear, I've lost your card. An audience participant came up to me early, Dr. John Bergengren. Dr. John Bergengren has a local website, ecodiversity.org, and he is an actual scientist. He came up to me at the beginning of the talk, and I asked him to be kind and not criticize too much, because I am a historian. Every so often we'll get a scientist who says, "Why are you doing this?" And I'll tell them, calm down, calm down. It's the people who do the history of science or people who do the history of medicine. Nobody who does the history of science or history of medicine is going to go out and start seeing patients tomorrow. And I'm not going on Channel 6 and predicting the weather either. These are methodological tools that we use to get different answers. Climate's all around us. It's just a new way of looking at history. So. Question? Yes, sir.
It sounds like you're ahead of the curve on this because just last February, Joe Goldie and David Armitage came out with the History Manifesto, which was really a call for historians to return to the idea of the long array and to use big data to address important current day issues. And they talk about climate change as one of those. And this is really the first time I've sort of heard a historian doing that, but not just now, but having done the work